Good afternoon, everyone, or I think it's probably afternoon for most of us, or wherever in the world you're coming from. We are just letting all of the folks log in, and we will get started in just a minute. All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar, which is called A Time to Listen, Navigating Change in Higher Education. This program is sponsored by the Collaborative Center for Restorative Practices at the International Institute for Restorative Practices. My name is Kaylee Maroka. I serve as the Associate Director for the Collaborative Center for Restorative Practices in Higher Education. My pronouns are she, her. This webinar came together from a group of planners that we have within our Collaborative Center called our Founding Partners. We know there's a lot happening in higher education spaces right now, to say the least. For many, it's been a heightened time of change and uncertainty. However, the truth is that change and transition are actually really common to higher education campuses. We often serve as microcosms of our society, as well as critical sites for discourse and engagement about many of different issues within our society. So we designed this webinar with the intent of asking the question, what does restorative practice and the core value and skill of listening have to teach us during these times of change? So we've invited Kiyaana Cox-Jones, who's my brilliant colleague. She's an artist and an expert in listening work. She's going to spend some time with us today. Kiyaana is an instructor and implementation coach at the IRP, and I think she's going to tell you a little bit more about herself in her own way. So I will just hand it over to Kiyaana so we can jump in and get started. Thanks, Kiyaana.
Thank you, Kaylee. Well, hello, everyone. I'm so grateful that you were able to join me on today. So I will share more about who I am in a few, but I kind of wanted to start off in my own style. And we will use the chat, and Kaylee will be looking in the chat and share information from there. But I wanted to start off by just welcoming you to A Time to Listen. And I want to welcome you to this moment, not just as participants of a webinar, but as stewards of listening, as a listening revolution. Enter the space not just with your ears, but with a mindset of transformation. And I want you to see the work that you do in higher education, not only as a professional duty, but as a sacred opportunity, an opportunity to cultivate young adults, to connect meaningfully with colleagues, staff, faculty, and to hold space for communal growth. One of my favorite quotes from the late, great Dr. Maya Angelou says, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel. And as I begin, I want to honor that this is not merely a webinar based on pedagogical framework or theories. This is a call to action, a call to reimagine what it means to be in community, a call to reimagining listening on your campus as a way of being, a vehicle of change. And we will walk through these ideas that are grounded in theory, yes, but more importantly, we will breathe life into this theory. And we will let the stories and the theories come alive with attention and attentionality as we witness transformation. So I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. So who am I? Well, I'm Kiyaana Cox-Jones. I am a creative, a scholar, a mother, a wife, an artist. But most importantly, I'm a practitioner of listening and community-centered work. I am a graduate of Howard University. I am a graduate of the International Institute for Restorative Practice with a master's in social science, and I am currently pursuing a PhD in East-West psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies, where I will be blending this work of restorative practice, East-West psychology, and arts education. How do we use arts as a conduit of healing, as a conduit of listening, as a conduit of being in community with each other? This picture here is a photo of my family listening circle back in 2023, because this is the work that I do at home. It's a reminder that the work that we do starts with us. Now, as you can see, there is a little Minnie Mouse chair there because I have a 6-year-old daughter. And yes, she participates in our listening circles. We start off with a grounding. We ask questions. We go around. There are rounds. We use listening circles to develop, like, what are our plan of actions for the year? What are our goals for the year as a family? But also, because we are people and we are humans, conflict happens. Max Lucado has a quote that says, conflict is inevitable, but combat is optional. So because we are humans, conflict will happen. We have to have a way of moving forward when it does. And so our family uses listening circles. And so everybody was able to bring a chair. We have kitchen chairs in it. We have my office chair. We have a dining room chair, and we have Savannah Grace's Minnie Mouse chair. So it's just a reminder of the work that I do. That as a family, we practice sacred attention with one another. This practice transcends my profession. It's my personal work. It's ancestral. It is my life work. And so I want you to think about, as we process listening, I want you to think about, where did you first learn how to listen? Who molded it or did not mold it? Take a moment to think about that as we really center ourselves on this work of listening and what it means to be in community. Because at some point you were introduced to this, and you could have been introduced to it in a way that you were listening to respond, or introduced to it in a way that you were listening to hold space. And I love this quote here, that as you're thinking about what was your introduction into listening, this quote by Dean Jackson, he is a country artist. I listen to country music, but this quote about listening is an art that requires attention over talent, spirit over ego, and others over self. Okay, so I want to bring you in the room. You're going to hear a lot of me talking, but I want to bring your values and your spirit into this room. So I want you to answer in the chat your name, institution, then your role or title. And many of you probably have a number of roles or titles. So just share whatever you feel comfortable, and then complete the sentence. I know I've been truly listened to when. And I want you to answer that. And I want to give some time and space for this. And so Kaylee will, as you're pulling things as you're dropping things into the chat, Kaylee will unmute and kind of share some of those things with me. Go ahead and drop those into the chat. Name, institution, your role, and then I know I've been truly listened to when. And let's take a moment. And then Kaylee, we'll take about 2. I'll ask that you read 2 of that last prompt.
And I'm seeing quite a few answers here. One about feeling lighter.
Mm,
Also, feeling when a few folks sharing when they feel like people are able to paraphrase back
mm,
what they have said, when they feel seen,
absolutely.
when people understand the meaning, not just the words, is another thing that I'm seeing,
It's good. It's good.
and feeling understood and validated, and many
Good.
more.
Good. Okay. So thank you all for sharing. And as you are dropping them into the chat, take some time to go back and read what others shared. This work that we do is so important. And I heard a lot of, I feel this, I feel feelings matter. And we'll talk a little bit more about this idea of how feelings show up in higher education and in our professional spaces, and how we navigate that with listening, but how it's so important it is to connect with how people are feeling in this work of listening. So let's move forward. So, why listening matters more than ever in higher education? So, in the midst of post pandemic reentry, rising mental health challenges, and ongoing call for belonging, we are invited to consider how listening can become more than a reactive measure and a classroom tool. It can become a practice, a culture, a way of life. Now, in higher education, we are experts at creating policies and programs, but we often miss the moment to pause and listen, not just to data, but to people, to pain, to possibilities. So when we look at this idea that colleges are navigating more than curriculum, they are navigating people. And when we focus on one over the other, then we leave out the feeling, we leave out the emotions, we leave out the connectivity. And even when we think about social determinants, and these are the non-medical factors that profoundly influence our health outcomes. And we have to consider what this looks like on a college campus. Now, according to the World Health Organization, these determinants encompass the conditions in which our students and our staff and faculty work, live, learn, and teach in. And just as significant as any medical intervention, these environments shape our health experiences, determining whether they uplift us or weigh us down. Now, when we are addressing social determinants, it is not merely an academic exercise. It is a matter of creating shared responsibility for well-being across our campuses. Now, Dr. Gina Abrams does a great job breaking social determinants down in her presidential paper with the International Institute for Restorative Practice, which you can find on our website. But I just want to bring some things that she calls out there. It's a call for us to care not just for individuals, but for the intricate ecosystems that nurture our communities. This perspective emphasizes that systems and structures surrounding us must actively promote health, inclusivity, and connection. But these pressing questions remained. And so you're probably considering, okay, Kiyaana, well then how do we achieve this transformation? And I'm glad you asked. Through listening, through the fact that listening is a radical act of care. And listening circles is more than just responding to harm, but it should be a practice that lives and breathes on our college campuses. Audre Lorde has a great quote that talks about, without community, there is no liberation. And it's one thing to talk about freedom, but it's another to talk about walking out what that freedom looks like in liberation. And without community, it's hard to walk out what liberation looks like, sounds like, feels like. And what happens is we get lost in the process of building, that we never find our way in the process of being in community. And so we must manage a number of emotions on campus. And I know many people are thinking, but Kiyaana, there are so many emotions. We have the students, we have the faculty, we have the staff, we have the alumni, we have the trustees. There are so many emotions that we are balancing on our college campuses, especially in higher education, from a perspective of being this professional institution where we are educating people. But we also are building. And it's important that as we are building these spaces, that we consider affect, feelings, and emotions. Emotions and affects are not detours from the work. They are the work. And unfortunately, our institutions and spaces have long shaped paradigms that reward rationality, logic, and neutral posture. But neutrality is often a mask that distances us from our own affective experiences and from the humanity of others. Effective experiences, particularly those that are negative, can become barriers to trust, engagement, and connection. Now, here's this. There's a book that said The Body Keeps the Score. It's a great read, but it reminds us that they lodge themselves in our body. They linger in our meetings. They rise up in the silent tension that fills the air before discussion happens. But restorative practice invites us to name the emotion, to take responsibility for our emotional landscape, and to build capacity for others and their realities. So when we are centering emotions and affect in our work, it is a skill that requires us to be intentional and mindful. But let's think about this from the negative perspective. Fear, anger, anxiety, grief, these are not luxuries. They are nutrients for positive emotions. When we talk about positive emotions, they're not luxuries, they're nutrients for resilient communities. However, when we talk about negative emotions, they are signals, not symptoms. They're not symptoms that we should suppress, that we should ignore, because if so, they become ruptures in our institutions. Then we blame, or we lash out in anger, or there becomes a disconnect. Then there's feelings of hopelessness, and people no longer want to come to work. Students no longer want to be on campus. Students no longer want to be in class. It becomes education as a resource, but not education as a means of connecting. But when we think about positive affect, remember I told you, these are the ways in which our communities become resilient. And when we talk about this, there's this idea of psychological safety in our community environments, because now I have the space to say and be authentic about how I feel. There's a sense of shared purpose that connects us, and it shifts how we respond as a collective. As a collective, emotions become contagious. When we make space for authentic expression and build trust, we begin to co-create the emotional tone of learning spaces. I want you to pause for a moment and do some intrapersonal reflection. What emotions have been present in your department or office this year? I'll go back, whether it be positive or whether they be negative. What emotions have been present? And then what emotions have been missing? And I'm pretty sure you can think of the emotions that have been present. But now I want you to think about, what are the emotions that have been missing? Is joy missing? Even when we think about the negative affects of grief, they are necessary for students, staff, and faculty to process loss. And we are living in a time where loss is happening. Loss of funding, loss of people, loss of connection. And we have to be able to create space for those emotions. So what's missing? What's missing? Take a moment and write those things down. And every now and then I'll pause to really give space for you to think about that. So this is our engagement window with restorative practice. And it suggests that each function best when we feel safe, supported, and regulated with high accountability and high support. Too much stress, too much shutdown, too much lash out, and too little engagement, and then we disconnect. But I want you to think of it from this way in regards to how sound works and how it reverberates and connects us. And look at the social discipline window. This, what used to be called the social discipline window, because this accountability was control. And no one should ever have control over other people because it diminishes the connectivity. But we could hold people accountable, and we could offer people that support. And when we do that, it puts us in the space of width. But it doesn't mean that the 2 not in 4 is a bad place, because we often find ourselves in the 2 space, especially in higher education, or in the 4 where we enable students or we enable each other in our work. And recently in the not space where we become disconnected because of all of the loss, because of the disconnect. And where we want what most people would call the sweet spot is the width. And I want you to think about, what does width look like when we attune to presence? That's self. When I am attuned to how I am coming into spaces, am I coming into spaces in the width, ready to be collaborative? Am I coming into the space ready to connect? Or am I coming in the space disconnected? And what's disconnecting me? Am I attuned to presence? Then the other is the resonant feel. It is the sound of connection. So Dr. Debonish from CIIS, California Institute of Integral Study, really talks and has a paper that talks about Duani sound and resonance. And it's the reverberation of sound as a felt meaning. A lot of times we think of sound and our senses as what I can hear, how I translate, and how I respond. But Dr. Debonish is talking about true listening involves sensing the subtle, the unspoken, the vibration beneath the voice. When we are truly with, there's a resonance in the field. There's a sound on our campuses. The question is, what does it feel like? What does the sound of connection, how does it vibrate on your campus? When we attune to presence, when the resonant sound fills our space because we have connected with others. Sometimes sound is silent in the nonverbal communications of the theater and dance department, or the nonverbal communications in the chemistry department of mixing and the students learning and growing. When we do that, there's an invitation to the collective to speak your truth. There's an invitation to the collective to say that this sound is because of us. It's Ubuntu. Ubuntu is I am because we are. In this Ubuntu, in the spirit of Ubuntu, what is the sound of your campus? Where in your daily work do you sense silence? Where do you sense vibration? And what might be the sound that is beneath what people are saying or are not saying? Think about that. And when I'm attuning to self, am I to, not, a for, or with? With the resonant field, meaning how I'm connecting with others and the sound that's creating, is it to, not, for, with? Is it a negative sound or a positive sound that we are putting out? There's a new study that's developing in Eastern psychology that talks about the power of sound in collective spaces, the power of with, and the invitation that it sends out to others to now sound their voice, which leads us to the social ecological model, which we essentially walk through this idea of self attuning inward, and then others, the fields of the sound when we connect, and then the invitation of the communal and the collective. In the social ecological model, we understand that listening must start with self. I often say that the walk to with begins within. That you can't be with others successfully without being with yourself. And that once we've done that work, there's a reflection, there is a vibration that sends out to the collective that then impacts our organization, then impacts our public policies. It becomes a ripple effect in the water of which lives on our campus. So when we think about the social ecological model, I want you to think about this idea of a deep framework and it moving upward. And I love this picture because it's a reminder that this thing cycles through. It goes up, down, around, it's inward, it's outward, but it is a process. It is a framework to think about. If I am doing the intrapersonal work, there must be self-awareness of how I'm coming into this space. That means what biases shape what I hear? How do I respond when others are speaking? Am I listening and I'm attuning to what they're saying so that I can repeat it back? Or am I listening so that I can get my point across? Or am I listening so that I can learn something new every day? Am I self-aware of how my biases show up and who I tune out and who I tune into? Then if I'm building up, if I'm scaffolding up, in my interpersonal relationships, am I creating space for others to share openly and fully? I want you to think of this interpersonal that of listening as a relationship. What is your relationship with others in regards to listening? Do you have relationship with others in a listening way? Are you attuned to listening to others in a way that you are listening to the words that they are not saying? That you're watching their body language, that as you're listening to their words, you're also attuning to their body language, to the words that they may hesitate on. If we scaffold up, it becomes a collective and institutional process of the affect systems. This is where listening is a strategic imperative. Do our policies reflect what we've heard from our community? Do our practices on campus, in our offices, in our lecture halls, in our classroom reflect what we've heard? Does it reflect the sound on campus? If the sound on campus is one thing and we are doing another, there's a disconnect. And when we think about the social ecological model and this idea of deep listening, that the same way we scaffold up, we must think about this as you can scaffold back down. And that if the sound of the institution and the collective is a negative sound, then it creates interpersonal relationships that don't flourish. And eventually it creates intrapersonal awareness that says, I don't feel welcome, I don't have voice, I don't have agency, and I don't have belonging. Think about that. And I want you to think, where in my institution is listening encouraged? Where is it avoided? If I am really reflecting on deep listening, Am I self-aware enough to hear the sounds in my interpersonal listening relationships? And does it in, do I have enough influence in sound and listening to impact leadership culture, policies, and systems? Well, then when we do that, I want you to now think that deep listening, this framework has to become a relational practice. It has to become a relational practice, and that when we are deep listening, we make connections, and it goes from silent on our campus to sacred exchanges. Thinking about, am I truly open to what I hear in the silence that can then impact the stories and the way our community begins to operate? Many of our institutions, there's certain topics, there's certain things that we are silent about. Our students don't feel connected enough to talk about them. Our staff and faculty feel disconnected to engage in them. And so thus, there is a disconnect. So we are called to decolonize the way we approach conversations. That's moving from extractive listening to generative listening, meaning I honor what you choose to share and how it shapes us both. Listening has been colonized, and that there's only a certain group that we listen to. There was a old saying my grandmother used to say that the squeaky oil gets the noise, the louder ones gets the noise. So she would often say, because I was a silent child growing up, that she would say, Kiana, you have to speak up. You have to say something, because I'm the oldest out of a number of grandchildren. But growing up, I was often the quietest. And so I had to learn how to decolonize dialogue. That dialogue was not a form of relationship. Dialogue was just a way of getting out what I needed to say, because no one had ever created spaces where I could be heard. So excuse me, in my time of working at Muhlenberg College, I had the opportunity of working with an amazing partner, Robin Riley Casey. And through my time working there and working with the students as an assistant director, I learned how to decolonize dialogue. And thinking about the way in which it was structured, who was leading those conversations, essentially, dialogue was one sided. And I needed to learn how to make dialogue, make it reciprocity, make it a two-way street versus a one-way street. But it started with the fact that in my own dialogue with my personal self, there was a silence, and it wasn't a sacred two-way street. So when you think about this from an intrapersonal perspective, reflective journaling is important for you to get out what you need to say prior to you connecting with others. Most of the time, we talk a lot and listen less because we've never been heard. So when someone is requiring of you to hold space for them, you can't, because we have formed dialogue the way in which we've taught. The same way when we think about affect, feeling, and emotions, and this idea that there's the psychological part, but then there's also the biological part. And then there's the biology part and the biographical part of how we were raised and our habits and how we show up. So our emotions come into our dialogue. And if we've been taught that our feelings and emotions show up in dialogue in a certain way, then now that is the way that we construct all of our conversations. And we no longer hold space. It's not reciprocity. But when we deconstruct it and we decolonize dialogue, we find the room to find the sweet spot in the width. What does that look like, Kiana, on a collective level? It looks like listening is our policy. What if we lived in a world where listening was a policy? It was the wellness. Even when we think about, I want to share with you this idea of the Okanagan Charter, that it's this work being done in higher education where we embed wellness into the structure of our campus, not just for students, but for the staff and the faculty. It is how we do this work together. It is people, it is planet, it is place. How do we treat our community? Are we listening to the land of our community? Land is so important. The land is speaking to us. Are we listening to the people on our community? Are we listening to the people around our community? Many of our institutions are located in cities that the sound is different than it is on our campus. There's two different sounds, which means we are no longer even interacting with the cities and towns in which our institutions reside in. The Okanagan Charter remind us that the place that we belong has a sound of wellness, and we need to know if we're meeting that. Are we sustaining the efforts of our people of mental health, of physical health, of holistic health? What does that look like? In our financial aid office, are we listening to the needs beyond forms? Are we listening beyond what students are putting on a FAFSA? Can we have listening circles in regards to what students need to flourish? Peer-led listening spaces. Are we listening in student leadership? Are we listening in faculty meetings to what's not being said? What's not being said? What's being said outside of the curriculum? When we think about this from across the campus, are we co-collaborating across the campus? One of the things at Muhlenberg that we did really well was we wanted to understand the voices of those not on our side of the campus. What are you thinking? What are you feeling? What are you believing? How do you want to show up on this campus? And how can we do this work too with each other so that way different voices all can be heard? Culture is not changed by mandate. Culture is changed by modeling. This is how we shift the culture. By making listening a discipline of leadership, we create the soil for transformation. What is one meeting or process could you redesign to include intentional listening? Just think about it. One meeting, one process, one practice that you can redesign to include intentional listening. Robin and I got to the point that in the Office of Multicultural Life, everything became a circle. Everything, every meeting, every task, every opportunity to connect with students, with others became a circle. There was always a check-in opportunity. As a matter of fact, Robin and I would not start a meeting without a check-in, even though people were like, let's just get to the task. And we were like, well, we care about you. We care about how you're showing up to this space because honestly, we learn more sometimes in understanding how people are showing up than we do in just moving on to the task. So it became embedded in our practice that listening and circles were a non-negotiable. So I want you to think about what's that meeting or process or practice where listening is a non-negotiable, that you can redesign intentional and active listening. And even I want you to go as further to think about how does this look in your own personal lives? In your own personal lives, are you in the with space and being attuned? In your own personal lives with family. Because often when we do this work, I have the opportunity of being an instructor with the International Institute for Restorative Practice. When we're traveling and meeting with educators across the country, often we hear that they show up one way in the classroom, one way on campus, and another way at home. Because there's no intentionality from the intrapersonal perspective. So we do interpersonal really well sometimes, and we struggle with the intrapersonal, or we do collective really well, but we struggle with the inter and intrapersonal. So I want you to think about what does this work look like in your sphere of experience, your sphere of influence. When we listen together, we learn how to heal together. Clearly, there is a need to listen in our country, in our world. Collective listening is the foundation of collective care. It allows multiple truths to exist, and it invites us into co-responsibility. What would it look like if every campus department held listening sessions with their community once per semester? Not just in a crisis, but in care. What would it look like if this became our common language? If listening was the norm because it was first an agreement. Take a moment to consider what would our campus look like if listening became the priority? If listening was the governance? If listening was the center of HR? If listening was the center of how we hired, if listening was the center of how people transitioned out and transitioned in, if listening was how we connected with our alumni, if listening was how our trustees heard us and we heard them, what would be the outcome? And I'm not saying that it's an easy process, but it is a process worth considering. So, a starting place. When we start this process, the first step is to lean inward. I love acronyms because it's an easy way to remember. So please take a screenshot of this. Lean inward first and ask yourself the question of, am I truly able to hear what others are saying, even when I disagree? See, you thought I was just going to say just about listening, period. But what about even when you disagree? Can you find something that you can agree with or understand or give, or something that someone is saying or not saying that allows you to lean forward by first leaning inward? Inquire with humility. Be curious about whose voices are unfamiliar and why. Bias is not a bad word, it's not a potty word. It's truth, and that our lived experiences have shaped what we connect to, what sound resonates with us in our physical bodies, and why. And if there's a sound that is not familiar to you, how can you become more connected to it? What part of campus have you not heard lately? What part of your institution are you disconnected from? S, seek resonance, not resolution. Often, when we think of listening and dialogue, we are thinking of the way it's been colonized to resolve, to come up with a resolution, rather than to create a resonance of sound that collectively we've been heard. And maybe this is not the time right now to figure out a solution, but we can come back later. So, how can I allow truths to land fully before responding? And then I want you to think of tend to relationships with presence. With presence, am I truly present? I have it's almost like a warm-up routine. My sons are athletes, and so before they play football or any other sport, they have a warm-up process. There are things that they drink, there are things that they eat. They now have like a whole playlist. I think it's Ray Lewis. I've always listening to Ray Lewis to get them excited and warmed up. And I decided in order for me to fully be present in relationships, to decolonize the way that I dialogue and listen to people, that I needed a warm-up routine. And so I have certain songs that remind me to listen. There's a text message that I sent out to my family to say, excuse me, I'm gonna be holding space for people. And if it's, please contact dad, or please contact auntie, please contact this person, because I'm gonna be holding space for people. So there are things that I do, whether there's my own process of journaling of things that I feel in regards to the topic that I'm going to be holding space for people. So that way I'm not taking up too much space, releasing that I'm not using enough space to listen. And so I use my warm up process to prepare myself to tend to relationships by being fully present. And the question you need to ask yourself is, can people trust me with their voice? Can they trust me that um, we often say that stories stay, but lessons leave? Can they trust me that the lessons that I take from them will leave, but their story is safe? Can they trust me that I'm going to create a brave space and not ignore their emotions? That I'm going to be aware of my own affect, feeling, and emotions and how it shows up in me. And I often think in my warm up, like, what if this is said? How will I respond? Worst case scenario, Kiyaana. And trust me, worst case scenario has happened in doing this work, whether it's in K through 12 or whether it's in higher education, because young adult students are exploring, they're away from their parents, and you never know what you're going to hear. And so often having to prepare myself for the best case and the worst case scenario. Then I want you to think about elevate communal truths. And this one is so important. What are we hearing together that we could not hear alone? There are certain colleagues that I work with that bring a different level of understanding and clarity that I was in the not box without them. So I want you to think about elevating communal truths mean that you have to connect with other departments and other people on campus. Cross campus connection is so important to elevate truths because there's something that your colleagues are hearing in another department that will influence how you respond in yours. What can I hear when I'm working with a certain group of people that challenge my beliefs, that challenge what I believe to be true? Because it's your truth. But there can multiple truths exist at once? Yes, they can. And so I want you to think about what truths have I ignored because there's not a collective voice? Take a moment to think about that. I can sit in silence. And then lastly, I want us to think about how we normalize a culture of restorative response. How do we normalize the culture where our responses are restorative, meaning they invite belonging, they invite community, they invite agreement, they invite listening rather than just responding, they invite care, they invite brave spaces, they invite truths that could sometimes hurt because it's not what you've been exposed to. But how can we normalize that true dialogue and true listening doesn't always look like how I seen it growing up or how my department has always done it? Because I've been here for so long. So this is how we've done it in the past, and this is what feels normal, the norm to us. But maybe we should normalize that this is a department thing and not a culture thing, a full campus culture thing. How do we shift to a full campus culture where the new norm is everybody's perspective and not the majority? What are the who are the voices that are missing from our conversations? What are the cultures that are not taken into consideration? Do we need to restore listening as a daily practice and not as an event? It becomes an event, and so we do it twice a year. And then that becomes a session where people are just spilling out what they feel because we've never cultivated the space where, for the most part, we were doing it in a positive way, not just to respond, but to be proactive. Is listening responsive or is it proactive on your space in your institution? Listen, lean inward. I inquire with humility. S, seek resonance, not resolution. T, tend to relationships with presence. E, elevate communal truths. And N, normalize a culture of restorative response. I want to say this: listening is love in action. And students, I would like to say students, but I'm going to course correct myself and say that we all respond better when love is at the center of the work that we do. And I know we stated that normally in our institutions, we don't lead with emotions. We lead with neutrality. But now we're seeing that people want to be heard. People want to hold space. People want to listen to you. I know that you came here in a space to figure out how can I hold space for others, but I want you to think about the fact that there are people in your institution who actually want to hear from you. Yes, I said that. They want to hear from you. We end today not with answers, but with sacred questions. I want you to consider, where can you begin listening as a practice and not just as an act? In your department, in your office, in your group? Where do you have influence on campus to implement deeper listening? Where do you have influence? Where does your voice carry weight? Who else can you give room to so that their voices can be heard? What would it look like if listening were not an afterthought, but a foundation? Let us imagine this. What if listening was a policy? What if it was woven in our daily fabric of how we lead, support, and create? I want you to take a moment to close your eyes, and I want to share this poem with you in regards to listening. If listening were policy, there would be no forms without feeling, no meeting without meaning. Memos would breathe. Take a deep breath in, blow the air out. Emails would pause to reflect. Hallways would echo with sacred exchange. Zooms would be a new level of connecting. If listening were law, silence would be protected. And stories would not need translation. We would gather, not to fix, but to hold. We would hear each other until we remembered. We would hear each other until we heard something that was not said. We would hear each other until listening produced funding because we were collective. We would hear each other and we would remember in a way that reminded us we belong to one another, because Ubuntu, I am because you are, and you are because I am. I want you to take a moment to look at these quotes and think about which one is resonating with you after what was shared today. Which quote you want to use as a starting place for this work of listening, as a starting place of how you show up in dialogue with others. And then once you decide, I want you to type it in the chat, but we'll do it like a waterfall. And you can just hit 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, so you don't have to type the whole in. So starting at the top and then working your way down. And a wise old owl set on an oak would be 1. And then the Dr. Maya Angelou quote would be the last quote, 5. So type it in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Don't hit send yet. We'll do it all together. Again, so listening is the starting place. It's a starting place. And I don't know where the ending, where this work ends, but I know that it's an ending place that will be much better if we start with listening. So now on the count of 3, we'll go ahead and drop those into the chat. 1, 2, 3. Oh. Take a moment to look at some of where others in this space are resonating with. I want you to take a screenshot of this so that you can remember your quote. And I want you to think about, where am I going to start? And Peter Block reminds us that when we are doing any kind of work and thinking about implementation, you start off with the room that you're in. You start off with you. How do you start off with listening with yourself? Then I want you to think about, how do you start off in the areas that you have influence, your direct connection with other people, your interpersonal relationships, whether that's with family, you saw my chair there, our family circle, or whether it is in your direct department. And then I want you to think about, what would it look like collectively on our campus or in your institution? And then I'm going to end with this. I love this Brene Brown quote that says, if we share our story with someone who responds with empathy and understanding, shame can't survive. Often we talk about all the other emotions and affects and how they show up, but we don't talk about shame. A colleague of mine, Beth Small, said, there's a group for grief, there's a group for anger, but there's not a group for shame. And when shame shows up, we respond in a way that disconnects us from ourselves and from others. But it cannot survive when we respond to people with empathy and understanding. You taking one moment to shift how you listen, to shift how you listen to yourself, to others, and the sound of the community around you can shift how shame shows up. Thank you so much. I am Kiyaana Cox Jones, and I am so honored to have spent this time with you. And I hope that something I said resonated with you, something I shared resonated with you. And please feel free to reach out to me. Haley, can you please share my email in the chat? I would love to connect with you if you have any questions or want to know what this work could look like on your campus in a listening circle, which is just one of many ways that listening can show up. Thank you, and I'll turn it back over to Kaylee.
Thank you, Kiana. And we really appreciate your time today and obviously your brilliance in sharing that with our communities and our teams. We will send out a recording of this webinar to everybody that registered, as well as Kiana, we have some requests for some resources. So I might ask you to send some of those over so we can include that in the email as well. And I hope everybody has a great rest of their day, and we will see you soon.